Turning points of the Civil War. First, we're going to look at the naval warfare going on in this time. The Union, as you can see in this map, is going to basically set up a naval blockade around the so-called Confederacy. They're also then going to try to capture like key seaports and river towns. This was for two reasons. This was firstly to prevent like armaments, clothing, food, supplies from actually reaching the so-called Confederacy. But then the second thing it was made for was to keep like items like cotton and tobacco from leaving the so-called Confederacy, thus hurting the so-called Confederacy economically. This trade was really necessary for the South because, first of all, it brought in a lot of money, but second of all, it brought the so-called Confederacy into contact with like European nations, which really was their hope when it came to the diplomatic front. I'm going to get more into that in just a second, but I want to talk about this naval blockade and the Navy and stuff a little bit more. We're going to see the so-called Confederacy try to break this blockade and defend their coast, and they would build like several warships to attack these Union ships, and briefly they do disrupt federal operations, but then the Union will regain its advantage. This is one of those moments in history that historians like to argue about when it comes to how effective the Union naval blockade was. We do know for certain that the Union naval blockade definitely did hurt the Southern cause, but how much it hurt it is really the question. And like I said previously on a different video, remember, the South never loses a fight because of them not having enough supplies. Had the war gone on longer, would that have happened? Once again, we don't know. The other part of this is the diplomatic front. So this is going to be a little bit reminiscent of the American Revolution. Remember, during the American Revolution, America really counted on aid from their eventual ally, the French. And so the so-called Confederacy really needed another nation to recognize them. Early on in the war, Great Britain is going to declare themselves to be neutral. France will follow suit. But the so-called Confederacy hoped that they might get diplomatic recognition and maybe even get, so an economic ally or even a military ally. But the only way they were going to get that is if they could show they could secure their own independence on the battlefield, just like the Americans had to do during the American Revolution. So the so-called Confederacy's way of doing this was they were hoping that Lee's victories in the spring of 1862 might cause the British to intervene on their behalf. And it basically is pretty decided that if Lee emerges victorious from his planned invasion of the North, then perhaps Great Britain would acknowledge the so-called Confederacy. However, what actually happens is the Battle of Antietam. In September of 1862, Lee is going to cross the Potomac into Maryland. So remember, he is the strategy of the best defense is a good offense. So he's taking the battle to the north, even though, keep in mind, once again, the so-called Confederacy really only had to fight a defensive battle to truly win overall, had they wanted to. Had they wanted to do a defensive battle, I should say. So the Union is going to end up finding a copy of Lee's order, actually, and they are going to chase after him, but they still give Lee enough time to basically retreat to a defensive position along Antietam Creek. So this is once again going to be Lee versus McClellan. The Battle of Antietam was the bloodiest single day of fighting in American history at this time period. In one day, you have 2,100 Union soldiers die, and you have 2,700 Confederate soldiers die. On top of that, you have another 18,500 wounded overall. Now, technically, this is a tactical draw, But because it's a draw and not a win for the so-called Confederacy, it ends up actually being a strategic defeat for the Confederacy. And this is really a turning point in the war because, first of all, it kept Lee from directly threatening like northern industries and financial institutions in the North. And secondly, it prompted Britain and France to basically abandon any plans they might have had to recognize the so-called Confederacy. And then thirdly, it basically provides Lincoln with a victory that was needed so that he could announce the abolition of slavery. So, this is all of the lead up to the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln, as we've seen before, despised slavery, but he had always maintained that preserving the Union was really his primary goal. He really realized he had to stress the Union and equivocate on slavery, basically to keep Northern public united in support of the war. The possibility, though, of emancipation as a war objective was considered by many Northern individuals as well as groups. In 1862, Lincoln proposed a resolution to Congress that would adopt supporting compensated emancipation of enslaved. This measure died, though, because Congress basically failed to appropriate enough funds for it. And quite frankly, slaveholders in the border states had no interest in the plan. They didn't want their enslaved property to be bought and given their freedom. They didn't want to give them up. However, pressure for some form of emancipation is mounting basically in the spring of 1862. And so as a response, a Republican-controlled Congress would prohibit slavery in the territories. So everything that has been leading up to the Civil War, that flashpoint of the territories, now slavery is prohibited in the territories. On top of that, a Republican-controlled Congress would go on to abolish slavery in D.C. Now, they did this through compensation. So they basically compensated slave owners, and then they took it a step further and colonized freed slaves in Black republics such as Haiti and Liberia. Then you get things like in July of 1862, the Confiscation Act, which ordered the seizure of land from disloyal Southerners and the emancipation of their slaves. So it's looking at just, disloyal Southerners, but that gets really complicated. Who is loyal, who is not, what is the degree of loyalty, and yada, yada, yada. So we're seeing clearly support for emancipation has grown in the North, but really it's not favored by the majority in the North, especially when you're including the border states. Which, keep in mind, you can see the states omitted here. Those are our border states. There were other considerations, though, in mind with the idea of emancipation. If the North was to go on to free the slaves, this could appeal to the strong anti-slavery sentiment in Great Britain and gain their support. So we look at that diplomatic front. The other thing is it could potentially weaken the so-called Confederacy's ability to wage war by basically removing a crucial source of labor. So Lincoln has basically decided on emancipation to a certain extent, which I'll get into in a second, but he needed a battlefield victory to announce it, and he finds that battlefield victory in Antietam, even though it was a tactical draw. So on September 22nd of 1862, he is going to put forward the Emancipation Proclamation. This frees all enslaved in all the states still in rebellion. So this does not free every slave. This only frees the slaves in the states that are still in rebellion. And you can see on this map exactly which states are omitted, because those would have been border states that would have been part of the North, the part of the Union that did not secede and therefore are not in rebellion. And you even have some areas that were exempted in certain states and counties because they had remained loyal to the North or the Union. So these are in areas of federal occupation, I should say. Now, the hope with this was to shorten the war, as well as maintain the border states' neutrality. But as much as this comes across as primarily being a military necessity, there definitely was some moral reasoning behind it. We know this because we have the minutes from Lincoln's cabinet meeting following the victory at Antietam, and he expresses that moral issue as well. The thing is, this outrages the South. And in fact, the South hoped that this proclamation would reinvigorate the Southern war effort, whereas those in the North generally approved of it. Even though not necessarily a majority were for emancipation, they recognized that there was some military advantages with emancipation. On top of that, the Civil War began as a war to save the Union, but now it goes beyond that. It's almost like a holy war of deliverance. And of course, those enslaved are going to rejoice as news would reach them through the grapevine. The thing is, for months before the Emancipation Proclamation, many slaves had run away, understandably so, to Union camps. They had done what they could for the Union cause by, digging trenches, scouting for federal troops. And so this emancipation, more than anything else, accelerates slaves' flight from bondage. We also see increasing numbers of former slaves joining in the army in the North as well. In fact, about 80% of black soldiers and sailors who fought for the Union were former slaves or freed black men from the South. Really, really quick, I always get somebody who says a free slave. You can't use that term. Say former slave if you mean that they used to be enslaved. So just be careful of that. We're going to see that Lincoln strongly advocated enlisting slaves, partly in hoping to end the South's rebellion. But this had a contrary result. Unfortunately, the appearance of black Union troops infuriated the Confederates. The so-called Confederate government saw white officers leading black troops, and they viewed them as basically instigators of slave rebellions and generally punished them accordingly, presumably by hanging and sometimes even worse. Black soldiers, if they were captured, oftentimes were returned to slavery. The Southern prisoner of war were treated terribly, and the conditions were just really horrible. So much so that Lincoln would retaliate by suspending prisoner exchanges, and you start seeing the prisons in the North holding prisoners of war also deteriorate. Sometimes the so-called Confederate treatment of African American prisoners was actually worse than just a return to bondage. For instance, when black soldiers along with white officers surrendered at Fort Pillow, Tennessee, they were killed. But black volunteers continue to show up for the Union side because, quite frankly, the promise of freedom and redemption outweighed the dangers of combat. One of the most famous regiments was the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry Regiment. This is seen in the movie Glory, if you want to watch that. It's a very good movie. Black soldiers, that being said, generally received lower pay and were supposed to perform the most menial duties in camp. Despite this discrimination, they would fight valiantly, and they would be given credit for it. For instance, the futile assault by the 54th Massachusetts Regiment on Fort Wagner, that was basically a suicide mission to a certain extent. We see the press heaping praise on them afterwards, which, yeah, I know I just spoiled the movie Glory for you a little bit there, but there you go. Really good movie. I should point out some inconsistencies. The movie makes it sound like all of the people in the 54th Regiment were former slaves, when in reality, the 54th Regiment was actually made out of more northern African Americans, and therefore not former slaves. The other thing is, at the end of the movie, yeah, they have this futile assault on Fort Wagner that does not go well. The Matthew Broderick character, Ferris Bueller, if you know him from that, he did die in reality, but they make it out like 80 or 90% of the soldiers died in the assault, and really it was only something like 25%. So it wasn't quite as deadly as the movie makes it out to be. But like I said, really good movie. Definitely should watch it, even though it has some, historical inaccuracies. However, we're going to jump back to actual battles, though, for a second here. We're going to see that McClellan fails to keep Lee from escaping after the Battle of Antietam. So Lee is going to remain a formidable fighting force at this time, and so-called Confederate forces are going to mass together in Virginia and really remain largely intact at this point. So I ask you this question as a part of your journal. Do you think there was any way that slavery would not have ended with the Civil War?